All right, welcome everybody. My name is David Kopshever. I'm a volunteer ranger here at Katmai National Park. I'm hanging out today with Ranger Michael and Ranger Leslie. We're going to be doing a live chat for the next hour. If you're not familiar with the live chat setup, you can ask us questions below the live video feed. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can. I'll kind of be posing questions to Michael and Leslie. They've been doing some bear research over the last couple of years here in Katmai. We're not in Brooks Camp right now. We've moved on. We're back in King Salmon in the headquarter offices here. So there's no more rangers in Brooks Camp at this point. So we're kind of finishing up our season here. You guys are going to be working on some kind of behind the scenes work. You can maybe tell the audience about that a little bit about that. We want to thank Explore.org for having us on here. None of this would be possible without Explore. If you're not familiar with Explore, maybe you're new to the cams, I would highly suggest checking them out. All their different webcams. They've got cams all over the world, in Africa, on different places in Alaska. So brown bears, eagles, tigers, all kinds of cool stuff you can check out. So definitely check them out if you're new to the cam experience. So maybe we can start with just what are you guys doing back here in headquarters? What kind of work are you doing when you're not in the field?
The really exciting data entry.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we have an entire season's worth of data from a lot of different projects. So we spend a lot of time getting all of that sorted out, trying to get reports written, trying to prepare for next season. All the really exciting stuff.
So it might not be the most exciting, but it's all part of the larger goal of learning about the bears and then protecting them. So
very exciting to start that project after talking about it for a couple of years here and planning it for a long time. So actually starting the sample collection was very exciting. I suppose I would list that as a highlight. Yeah.
So this is the first season that you actually started
darting or any sample collection at all. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. How would you say it went so far for the first go at it?
I had dreams and expectations of everything going off perfectly with zero problems, but that's simply not the way science often works.
Of course.
Or anything for that matter. So it went pretty well. July was a little bit rough. We were trying out some new equipment and it was not working as well as we had originally hoped. So we ended up spending August getting different tools and trying something different in September, which went much better. Outside of the darting, hair snares went very well, although this year we were sort of experimenting with where to set them up. So,
Collection went up quite a bit.
Yes, went up drastically once we got the new equipment. Brooks Camp and sort of a few other areas throughout the park. There's also, I'm getting samples from the ongoing Changing Tides project out on the coast. So we're getting blood samples from bears that are captured as part of that project. The state is helping out with some sample collection from bears that are hunted from the surrounding region outside of the park and up in the preserve. So they're providing samples from some of those bears. So we have a lot of different techniques for getting DNA. Basically any means I can to get a sample from as many bears as possible, I'm going to take advantage of.
Awesome. So we want to spend as much time as we can kind of asking you guys questions, putting you guys on the spot. This is kind of going to be the last time this season, at least, that people will get the chance to ask you questions. So we're just going to kind of jump right into it here. We've got a lot of questions on hibernation, which is very relevant right now. The bears are the bear action is starting to taper off along the river. So we'll just jump right into it. We got a question here of how close do bears typically den to one another? There's a lot of information that's not known on bear denning. They den in secret to some extent. So we might not have answers to all the questions, but we've got about 100 questions here. A lot of them are about bear denning.
I'm pretty sure Leslie has the answers to all of them.
Yes, whatever I can't see from the trees, stay on the coast. Not on my radar.
So I know you've done kind of like aerial surveys, looking at Dumpling, or maybe some other mountains. I think you've done that.
You mean for looking at dens? So I have not been involved in den surveys here in Katmai. There have been den surveys that have been done here in 1974, I think, and then again in 2012 and 2013 they redid some den surveys. The 2012-2013 den survey was less of an attempt to actually count the number of dens and more of an attempt to evaluate a new technique for surveying dens. So that one didn't come out with as many of the specifics of like, how many dens we're seeing in various areas throughout the park. It's more just seeing whether or not this new technique works.
So it seems like we see a lot of bear dens on Dumpling Mountain. Would that be kind of the main place that bears go that are using the Brooks River? Do you think they spread out quite a bit? Like you said, the studies haven't been done.
I do know that the 1974 study found Dumpling Mountain to be one of the primary denning sites, there was a high concentration of dens on particularly the north side of Dumpling Mountain. Also over in the Savanoski drainage, there was a series of mountains that had a high concentration of dens. Any of the mountains around here, you're going to get dens on. It's not just Dumpling by any means. Any of these mountains, you'll find some dens.
Right, yeah, I'd say the mountains close by were highly concentrated with the dens, so likely that most of them just stay around in the area, although it is not out of the question for bears to travel hundreds of miles and go someplace else.
Wow.
We don't have collars and have not had collars on these bears at Brooks Camp, so we don't know where they're going to den. We don't even know where they go in August, where they're still up and moving around, and should theoretically be easier to find and track. We have no idea where most of the bears go. We have ideas that we know some bears go over to like Margot Creek or something like that. But that's a few of the bears. We don't know if that's the majority of our bears. We don't know if they're going up to Headwaters Creek or where they're going. So denning in particular is very tough to figure out where they're all going.
It's not, Katmai isn't a very easy place to walk around.
No.
So, navigating over the mountains and through all this thick bush makes it very difficult to track bears if we're not using collars or anything like that. We've got some more questions about how bears maybe get to their den. How long do you think it takes a bear to travel maybe towards the top of Dumpling to wherever they go to den?
I would be surprised if a bear could very easily make it to the top of Dumpling in one day. And you and I can make it to the top of Dumpling in one day fairly easily.
And I'm not in that good
shape. Bears can do it very easily. So if it takes them longer than that, it's only because they're checking out other places and eating along the way and stuff like that, instead of trying to make it straight to a denning site.
And along those lines, how long do you think it takes a bear to dig its actual den?
On average, I think it's 3 to 7 days for excavating a den.
Okay. And so they excavate just enough space for them to fit inside, right?
Enough for them to be inside and kind of be able to turn around and stuff,
So these bear families, maybe a bear like 132 with really big cubs, or or some other family where there's 3 or even 4 cubs, do they all den in the same den, or do they dig separate dens? Do we know how that works?
There is some.
That's okay. We don't need it.
So I've seen some reports. I haven't extensively researched that or anything, but I've seen some reports that would suggest that spring cubs, when they go back into the den for the first time, usually will den with the sow again. But then as those cubs get older and you start getting the year and a half, 2.5-year-old cubs, those ones are more likely to be in a separate den that's nearby where mom is, but perhaps not in the same den.
This is a question that I think is very interesting. We've talked a little bit about in the past, we kind of alluded to the fecal plug. Do we know how that is created? Is it grass and vegetation that they eat? I know, it's a very interesting thing to think about.
So I have some experience with captive grizzlies as well. And I know that some people that I work with captive grizzlies don't necessarily buy into the fecal plug thing so much. What I have seen is it doesn't seem to be so much a matter of what they're eating. Usually prior to going into hibernation, you want to get rid of everything that's in the bowels because you don't want you don't want meat in your bowels that's then going to be rotting inside of you.
Right.
So generally they evacuate the bowels prior to going into hibernation. What you do end up with is sometimes you get dead intestinal tract cells that will build up, and hair and stuff like that builds up at the end of the intestinal tract. So you can end up with sort of a plug from that. But it's I'm not aware, and once again this is not 100% my area of expertise or anything. I'm sort of the opinion that it's less likely that plug is directly involved in preventing defecation throughout hibernation and more just a product of not defecating throughout hibernation. But yeah, not my area of expertise. Leslie's area of expertise, I'm sure, right?
So maybe a few schools of thought on that issue.
Yeah.
Okay. So moving on to kind of when bears emerge, how do they know when to come out of the den?
Good.
You want to go with that one? So hibernation is something that I spend a lot of time looking into. Not necessarily the fecal plugs so much in and of themselves, but hibernation is one of the most interesting things to me with brown bears, and actually a lot of my research is on hibernation physiology. So the whole timing of going into and coming out of hibernation is pretty much entirely unknown at this point. There's been a lot of theories from day length, temperature. Bears are somewhat active while they're still in hibernation, physiology. So they might get up and look around and say, "Oh, hey, look, there's a bunch of green stuff out here. Maybe maybe it's time." Yeah. It could be a circannual rhythm where there's an internal body clock that's telling them, "Okay, now it's time." Most likely, it is a combination of a whole bunch of different things. Maybe there is an internal body clock, but it's calibrated based on external temperature or day length or something like that. But yeah, we don't really know what causes that.
That's one of the really cool things about brown bears is that there's still so many things we don't know. There's still that mystery. So kind of a frontier of knowledge that we're still discovering. So this is another question that I've wondered a lot about. It says, if snow covers the entrance of a den and it melts from the heat of the bears inside, why do the bears not die from a lack of oxygen? In other words, if the den's completely covered, why don't they suffocate?
Something that I have tried to look into in the past, actually, and not found a lot of data. It doesn't mean the data doesn't exist, but I have not found a lot of data. My suspicion is that the metabolism slows down, the respiratory rate slows down enough during hibernation that the CO2 buildup is extremely slow, and it's slow enough that even if you end up with some melting of the snow, you still end up having enough permeation through the snow for it to replenish the oxygen inside.
Interesting. What kind of areas are the bears looking for when they choose a den site? Is there a certain steepness of the hill that they're looking for, a certain elevation?
Depends on where you're looking. It's going to be different for Yellowstone than for Denali and for here. Here, from those two studies that I have seen, the 2012 and the 1974 one, I think it's 1974.
It's around the
Yeah.
70s.
What I have seen doesn't suggest any particular aspect as far as north, south, east, west. As I mentioned, the north side of Dumpling seems like it's a pretty popular one, but over on the Savinoski, I see more on the, I think it's on the south side. I see more spots on those maps. So I don't see a particular aspect necessarily up here. Elevation, once again, varies greatly based on where you are. Here, of course, you go up a few hundred feet and you're practically above tree line. So there, I usually see, I think what I've seen as an average around here is 500 to 700 300
Right, yeah.
feet.
Usually they're anywhere from like 3 to 700.
Yeah.
Whatever that's done.
But with that said, you might go out on the edge of town here and find a hill that's at 40 feet above sea level that a bear's decided to dig into. That is certainly possible. Steeper slopes are generally better up to a point. They don't want a 90-degree cliff, but the 2012 study did say basically the steeper the slope, the better it was. They did not define a point at which it was too steep for the bears.
And is that so snow will cover it more easily?
It's easier to dig into a hillside. That's if you're going more from the side. Other people probably have more theories about why that is. Off the top of my head, though, I don't know why that is.
Sure. So the bears we're seeing right now, we're starting to see the bear activity kind of taper off. Some people have also noticed that the bears seem a little bit lethargic. Is that normal? Do bears get kind of low energy before they go hibernate?
It is certainly possible that their metabolism is starting to slow down. Hibernation physiology is not the same thing as denning. So hibernation is a suite of physiological traits, whereas the actual denning portion of that is something that occurs during hibernation, typically. So it is certainly possible that as it's been pretty cold recently, we've gotten a few snows. That's usually around the time. Usually the first snow of the season is something that's around when you start seeing a lot of bears going up and starting to dig dens. So it is very possible that some of them have started to transition into more of what we'd consider a hibernation type physiology.
And what triggers that? Is it the cold? Is it lack of food?
Same as coming out of hibernation. Yeah, we don't really know. There's a lot of theories, and it's most likely a combination of things working together. But yeah, we don't know what it is that triggers it.
Interesting. We saw some really fat bears at the end of the season.
I hear there was one that was particularly fat.
Yes, 480. He was huge. The runner-up, 435. She was also extremely large
Quite
at the end of the
rotund.
season. The question we have here is when female bears become pregnant, if they've gained enough weight prior to hibernation, does that suggest the bear who has packed on lots of weight, like 435 Holly, would she be more likely to have more cubs? Would she be more likely to have cubs at all? How does that work?
Yes and yes. She is more likely to have cubs. Usually if they're below about 25% body fat, they're probably, the fertilized eggs won't implant, essentially. 20%, some bears might implant, but usually it's around 25% they want. And then, they are more likely to have more cubs if they've got the resources to sustain those cubs.
Okay. That's for now from the pre-submitted questions. That's what we have on denning. So we're going to move on for now. Talk about. We want to ask Leslie some questions about bear monitoring over this last summer. Starting with, on the cams, we've been seeing more females lately than males. Is there a reason for that you can think of?
Not really. Yeah, so I stopped the monitoring back in early October, on like October 10th. So right now, cam viewers know more than I do about what's currently going on.
Yeah.
So yeah, I have no magical theories on this right now.
There did seem to be a lot of females with cubs this season.
Indeed.
Did you have a count on how many cubs there were?
I do.
Awesome.
Yes. So I've broken it down into like the July monitoring session and then the fall monitoring session, them being different. They could be combined, but there's always been discrepancies of being able to ID bears from July to fall. So to keep things a little cleaner, we'll just keep them separate. But yeah, we had around 19 cubs in July. Like 10 spring cubs, and we had 7 yearlings and some 2-year-olds. So we had definitely an increase in cub action. And then for the fall, so we had 18, 19, 20, 21.
Wow.
So
have you ever seen that many cubs?
I
in the
haven't
summer?
since being here. No. So it's suggesting that hopefully the bear population will be on the uprise. It's been the lowest since the monitoring has seen since it started in 2001. But yeah, it leads us to have no reason to be concerned that it's falling too low. But yeah, it kind of just seems to be the cycle of things.
Mm-hmm. So maybe next year we'll have a ton of subadults running around.
This is
Will
very
that be
possible.
absolute madness? What is that going to be like?
Probably for
Yes,
bear
yes it
management.
will be. Probably 2 years from now, more than next year.
Okay.
Although, if you look at data from like 2008, I think they probably had more subadults running around then than we will 2 years from now. There were just a ton of bears around, and a lot of them were subadults. But yes, 2 years from now is probably going to be very exciting for bear management.
Cool. Well, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, should be fun.
So, are there any other subadults identified, new subadults, other than 719?
There was 717 in July that was identified. I think it was also in fall as well, and that was a younger subadult, possibly a 2-year-old. Just looked pretty young, pretty small, and basically by its behaviors, it can be a great way to tell its age, and not just like a small female. So yeah, acting pretty skittish, fair fishing and just scrounging on the scraps. And then there was also in the fall another bear that was numbered that was given the number 720, and that was a little bit larger of a subadult, but still classified as a subadult.
Okay.
So a few new ones, yeah.
And so last time we talked, we had our live chat earlier in the season. There was mention of possibly a yearling cub that was on its own. Is that considered a subadult since it's on its own? Does it get counted in the
Yes.
monitoring?
It would, since it was on its own. I have a suspicion that it is the same lone cub that we had seen the year before, based off of very similar color markings, and it had a patch of missing fur on its rear end that this same what we were calling a lone cub also had. So I'm pretty sure it was the one that had been given the number 610 last fall. And so could possibly be a 2-year-old if it was a yearling on its own last year. But once again, it's a gray area. It's not exact science. It's just kind of based off of photos and behaviors and that sort of thing. But that's my suspicion.
Okay. So did you see it 3 times that make it into
Yes,
the? Okay.
it did.
And so, I'd have to imagine that a younger bear like that is going to have significant challenges to its survival. Can you maybe tell us what kind of things it's going to be running into, what it's going to be looking out for as it's trying to survive along the river?
Right, yeah, I'm probably looking out for more dominant bears. That was another key into looking to its behavior, and from like last year had very similar behaviors. Then again, any small bear on Brooks River is probably going to behave kind of like that,
Right.
Unless you're 503 and just pretending like you own everything.
He owns the jacuzzi.
Yeah. So it's gonna be scrounging for scraps. Maybe seen a little bit later if it needs to try to get some more nutrition before going into hibernation and that sort of thing. But its behavior was often that if it saw another bear, it was running immediately, or even sounds of other bears fishing. It was very nervous and kind of skittish behavior. So probably has learned a few hard lessons in life.
Yeah, which is good for its survival. I mean,
Right.
it sounds like it's
if
doing
it was
all the right
indeed
things.
the bear from last year, it at least made it through 1 year. So kudos to it.
Right, that's impressive. Do you have a list of all the bears this summer?
I do, yes. That has been one of my fun office tasks of going through, seeing which ones make the cut, the seen more than 3 times in observations, and coming up with the list. And each year I come out with a bear sort of ID log book, and come up for one for July and one for fall, and we keep some copies around, and those are the materials that go into making the bear ID book. And it is great reference for myself from going from year to year, and that's how I can look back and say, like, oh, perhaps that lone cub was the same bear, and other rangers can use this material for what bear is that?
Yeah, totally.
So yeah, that information will get passed along for the use of many.
Awesome. I've got a question here of, is it hard to identify the sex of bears during kind of the chaos of bear season?
Absolutely. I still don't know for sure. The lone cub 610, what sex it is. I wasn't able to see it urinate, and it's just right now a little fuzzball, so it's not exactly hard to identify any features. So yes, it can be very difficult, especially in fall. Many of the bears are swimming, snorkeling the whole entire time. Basically all you can see is the top of their head and their ears, and their faces are in water, so it can be incredibly hard to both just ID a bear and to tell what sex it is. So it can remain a mystery for a while, so don't feel bad, anybody watching on the webcams. I don't even know.
Awesome. Speaking of difficult bears to identify, or difficult aspects to identify, 68. That was a bear that really stumped everybody in the summertime. How did you determine that it was indeed 68 later in the fall?
Yeah, wow. I toil over those bear ID books I was mentioning and have looked through every page and photo hundreds of times, so sometimes you just have these mental images pop into your head. But yeah, it's looking at specific physical features that probably wouldn't change. I mean, the hard part between IDing a bear between fall and July is just they gain so much weight. But yeah, looking at things such as like protruding lower lip, or just kind of the ratio of where their ears are set and their muzzle. 68 kind of has like a higher ridge on the back of his like skull leading into his neck that was more prominent in July, and it was kind of a feature I'd recognized in the fall, where he had previously only been mostly identified in the fall. So it was kind of that whole looking at silhouettes and some of the features that may not change as much just by gaining hundreds of pounds.
Just by gaining hundreds of pounds. Yeah.
So yeah, it was looking at a lot of those features, looking through lots of different photos and kind of putting it all together.
Hours of toil.
Yes, exactly.
Basically is the answer.
Looking at photos.
Cool. So for now, I'd like to kind of move on to some darting questions, and as you guys throw questions into the chat box below the video screen, we can get back to kind of these other topics. So Michael, let's see, here we go. One of the goals, or perhaps one of the things that will happen with the genetics study, is we'll be able to maybe learn about some behavioral genetics of bears. What do we know about that subject? Are things passed down with nature versus nurture? Do we know anything about behavioral genetics in regards to bears?
Very little. There has not been a whole lot of research on the topic in bears specifically. Dogs, there's been a decent bit, and that may or may not be something that we could say is similar for bears. There is some research on, let's see, I think in Sequoia Kings with black bears, they did a little bit of research on whether or not bears that were, breaking into cars and stuff like that and getting into people's food, whether or not they were likely to transmit that behavior. However, that was not behavioral genetics necessarily. That was just, is that trait passed on? Right. What would make that behavioral genetics is then trying to determine what percentage of that is nature versus nurture. How much of that is a genetically coded behavior versus something that they're learning from their mother as they're growing up. And there's really not been a whole lot done looking into that, trying to figure out the genetic determination of various behaviors in bears.
So that's something very exciting that maybe we'll look to learn more about in the following years.
Yeah.
How many bears were you able to dart this summer?
Darting, I believe, so let's see, I know that you put a list up online. I think, believe the total number was 14 that I was able to get samples from. There were a few others that I darted that I was not able to get samples from as well. We talked about the difficulties in July, the bears that were darted that we did not retrieve samples from. And then there were a few in the fall as well that I darted and did not get a sample back.
And so it sounded like you kind of perfected some techniques.
I would say perfected is not the word used, but,
Improved upon,
yeah,
perhaps. Did you find it easier to dart in the fall because there were less people around, or was it more just kind of honing the technique of darting?
The opportunities to dart once camp closed certainly increased. Particularly, for fall, of course, there's a lot more bears in the lower river than there are up at the falls. So while camp was still open, darting in the lower river is not really an opportunity. They're not really an option. There's too many people around. I don't want to take the risk of upsetting a bear and then having it run off and run into a person. So during July, the only place where I can dart is up at the falls platform. So the opportunities were much more limited, whereas in the fall, once camp closed, then there were more opportunities to dart.
Of course, if you're up at the falls area, you can't dart a bear that's in the water, right? It has to be on land. It has to be, when the dart falls out, it has to be accessible.
Correct. And, and I don't want it to be in the middle of an interaction with another bear. I don't want it to be actively feeding or something like that.
Right.
So there's, a lot of things that I'm looking for that constrict it further.
Right. Did you run into any additional problems once camp closed with the closing of facilities? Did that hinder your ability to do any darting?
Not greatly. The only way that really impacted me was one of those self-imposed rules that I have is I try to make sure that when I'm darting, I'm doing so from a quote-unquote location of safety. So whether that's a hard-sided building or a platform or something like that. So the only thing that became more difficult was perhaps there were some cabins that were open and available for me to dart from that once they got fully shut down and locked up, then I couldn't dart from that location. So there's certain locations like the Overlook that became more challenging once all the cabins were locked up. But,
Do you have to, when you process the samples, do you have to refrigerate them? How does that part work?
So the samples are being put into a solution called RNA later that's designed to preserve nucleic acids. And then from there, so you put it in a refrigerator for 24 hours so that solution can permeate the tissue, and then you put it in the freezer just so that it'll last even longer. Tissues in RNA later will last quite a while, but they'll last longer if you freeze them too. So.
Okay. A lot of people saw you attempt to dart 480. Could you explain kind of what happened with that? I think some people thought you did dart him, and then we put out that full list of bears that were successfully darted. He wasn't on it.
I did not dart 480. I don't remember which direction he was going, but he went by the end of the bridge, and I got really excited because I was hoping to get a sample from him, and ran across the other side of the bridge and kept looking at it and not liking my position and not liking the way he was standing, and just there were a number of things that didn't make it a perfect shot for me, so I opted not to take the shot, and so I did not get one from him this year. So hopefully next year I'll be able to get that opportunity.
Next year.
We're coming for you, Otis.
He was such a big target.
Yeah, he was. It's true. It's true.
Another male bear that people saw you attempting to dart was 83. Would you mind kind of going into that situation?
Sure. So I attempted to dart 83 twice. One of the times I darted him, probably the time that most people are referencing. I darted him, the dart stuck into him, and he ran off closed trail and into the marsh and was gone with my dart. That does happen from time to time. The way that the needle is attached to the dart itself, occasionally when it hits the animal, a little bit of hair will get stuck in between the needle and the dart, effectively pinning it. So he wandered off into the marsh, and later on that day when we saw him again, he did not have a dart attached to him, but we do not know where the dart fell off, and we're not ever able to recover it, unfortunately.
So kind of one of the risks of the project, but overall, with what we can learn and how we can use that information, I would think the risks are certainly worth the reward.
Yeah, and I mean the risk of it here, we lost a dart essentially. That's the only that's the adverse implication. Doesn't seem to have caused any damage to the bear, any harm to the bear. He's still out there wandering around, or last time we were out there, at least he was still out wandering around. So yeah.
So with darting the male bears, is there any chance that you'll be able to determine what male bears are siring cubs?
That is the hope. That's why we're using the biopsy darts at all at Brooks River. Brooks is the only place we're using the biopsy darts currently, and the idea is to be able to figure out that lineage, trying to put together a pedigree of some sorts, essentially out there.
And so, what will that be able to tell us? Will that help with seeing kind of what behavioral traits are passed on?
So immediately, it won't tell us a whole lot, other than some, oh, hey, that's really neat. That bear's, cool, that bear's related to that bear. Right. In the long run, the hope is that we'll be able to continue collecting this DNA data, and then associate that with Leslie's monitoring data, and try to use that to figure out some of that behavioral genetics, and try to look at, for instance, if there's a behavior that is seen in certain boars that you then see in their offspring that is not displayed by the sow, then that's an indication that could be a genetically predisposed behavior.
Very cool. So there's been a lot of interesting stories that have kind of happened over the season. One of those is us finding the bear carcass out behind the platform. We compared its teeth to pictures of 814. They look very similar. Nothing can really be concrete about that, but it's something that was really interesting that happened over the season. Do you guys have any thoughts on that? Did you get to see the comparisons of photos?
Yes, I feel like Leslie is going to be the expert on whether or not that was a 814.
Right. Well, we can't say for sure.
Yeah.
How are you relatively convinced?
I mean, not seeing 814 this year kind of helps it if it looks and smells and talks and walks like it. Perhaps we could say it, but I'm kind of with you. We can't say for certain, but not seeing 814 this fall, and if we continue to not see him, there's a great likelihood it could be. Yeah,
and so next year we'll see if he shows up, and we'll all be, oh well, I guess that wasn't him.
Exactly.
Another cool story was 719 following around 402 in Cubs. That was a really fascinating interaction. Nothing that I ever expected to see.
Me neither.
Have you ever seen anything like that? Do you have any thoughts on that whole situation?
It was comical. Yes, it'll be interesting next year to kind of see what she ends up doing. If 402 is going to kick out her two, at that point they'll be 2-year-olds. Is 719 just going to go from mother to mother looking for nurturing? Or will she finally kind of step up and fill the sub-adult role that she's destined for, I guess. We'll see. But that was very interesting, especially since it happened to be 402, who's 503's mother. It's all a soap opera drama.
It is.
So I'd actually like to continue that discussion with a question, which is 719 is fairly widely believed to be 435's offspring, which is kind of part of what is contributing to this whole drama.
Right.
I would stick with the same. While it seems we can be reasonably confident that it is 435's. I'm curious how confident you are that is 435's offspring and not another subadult that came in.
Yeah, that is very true. That's kind of one of the risks of not having some sort of collaring or tagging or anything like that. Is it's never really for certain.
Right.
I personally feel very confident in it, but there's definitely room for human error in all of this.
Yeah, but it's just been so interesting to see her learn from her experience, if it is indeed her. and then the technique has been pretty successful. There was one instance where 435 charged 719, and 402 seemed to react. I don't know if you were able to see that or not. I didn't see it in person either, but I saw some videos afterwards. So 435 charges 719, and then 402 kind of backed off 435. I wouldn't venture to say that 402 was protecting 719, but it worked out in 719's favor. So kudos to her, I guess.
Yeah. She found a way to make it work.
Yeah. This is a really interesting question I have here. Yesterday, somebody saw 94 chase away a raven. There's also some video of other bears chasing away ravens. Is there any unique relationship with bears and ravens? They seem to tolerate gulls and magpies.
If that is a true statement, and bears do have a bigger problem with ravens than they do with other birds, which I have not spent the time observing with that question in mind to be able to answer whether or not that is actually the case. If it is, I don't know of any data that would suggest why they have a bigger problem. I could hazard a guess, which is just that ravens are more effective scavengers of the things that bears might still be interested in eating. So perhaps as a result of that, they would be more interested in chasing off a raven. But I do want to reinforce, I do not know that bears are more interested in chasing off ravens than they are any other bird.
Sure.
Yeah.
2 instances are not quite enough to make any bold statements.
Well, and you need to measure at what distance do they respond, and then compare that to other species, and it would be
the whole scientific approach.
I know, right? It's overrated, right? It's just overrated.
Another question here: do female bears exert the same method of dominance with each other as male bears? So the cowboy walking, the posturing, does that stuff happen with females as well, or is that more of a male bear?
I'd say it does exist, probably more subtly than when males do it, and it's almost a performance, it seems. But there's definitely hierarchies or ways that female bears will just kind of show that they're more dominant, protect their space better is kind of what I'm getting at than say younger bears. If you have anything else to add, just it's kind of more subtle, but still like dominance interactions.
So they still compete, just like male bears do, but maybe a little bit.
Could be for resources, for food, for their space bubble.
Another question here. We've seen 503 playing with 151 and 602 recently. In the past, we've seen 89 playing with lots of others. Do female bears, have they been observed playing with other bears as much as males?
From what we were talking about, I can't recall a time when I've seen two females playing with each other. I've seen females playing with other males.
Right.
I don't know if it's just...
I can't recall those instances.
Sure.
However, I would once again like to stress that neither of us has studied this as a research question or anything like that.
Right.
So I can't say for sure, but I can't think of any times where I've seen two females playing like that.
Right, unless they're still dependent in cubs.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I know I've read about that happening in McNeil bears, but I've also never seen it happen here that I can remember.
And so what I know I've seen more reports of is not necessarily two females playing together, but two sows that have dependent offspring coming together and their cubs all playing together while they just kind of are okay being around each other,
right,
but not necessarily actively engaged in the play. But
For adults.
Cool. So that's about the end of the pre-submitted questions. We're going to move on to some live on-the-spot questions now.
Can't Google these ones.
Okay, so Michael, were you scared to be so close to 480 in your attempt to dart him? And did Otis even notice you?
Interesting. I believe, no, I would not say that I was scared to be near him. He did not respond to me in such a way that I felt there was any concern for my safety necessarily. Certainly I wondered about, if I do dart him, what will his response be? Of course, that any of these bears could do this, but a bear his size could probably, rest an arm on the bridge gate, and it would break. So there is always that possibility of it. With every time I dart a bear, if I'm on the ground, it's always a question of how's the bear going to respond, and being mentally prepared for that is certainly necessary. Do I think he noticed me? I think he did. If I'm remembering correctly, I think his eyes kind of shifted over and he gave me that little sideways glance that they do sometimes. However, even if he didn't, I would guess that he was aware of my presence. Whether or not he chose to pay attention to me, I would guess that he was aware of my presence.
Have you been able to dart any bears since the list was posted on the Katmai terrain blog?
No. I have only attempted darting once since then, and that was a relatively short endeavor before it started snowing and sleeting and raining on us. That was the only time that I've tried. I'm probably done for the season with darting at this point. Getting to and from brooks, of course, is now much more of a challenge. The lake level is getting lower and lower, making boating back and forth a little more challenging. We no longer have a plane on floats because we took the beaver out of the water, and getting back and forth is a little more challenging now.
Okay. You talked a little bit about the new technique that the surveys were done on for looking for bear dens. Could you maybe explain what the new technique was, if you're familiar with it?
I wish I could. I have not looked at that paper recently enough to be able to explain the difference between what they did in 2012 and what had been done previously.
Sure. Yeah. When the bears are up on dumpling, do they have a water source to drink from? Do they need to eat and drink while they're digging their dens? You said it takes about 3 to 7 days. I would certainly want a sip of water or something.
That 3 to 7 days is not of them digging constantly. That's kind of, they go up, they might dig around a little bit, then they'll wander off, maybe eat some berries or something like that. Probably, wander down, get some water. There are a few streams that come off the side of Dumpling that they could use as a water source. So they're kind of out and wandering around, and then occasionally coming back and digging. They might dig most of it all in one day and then wander off for a day or two and then come back.
Some people saw a moose up on Dumpling Mountain the other day. We don't get to watch the cams very often because of our internet connection here. It doesn't quite support. We don't have the bandwidth to watch the cams. But do you think that more animals like moose or lynx or even wolves will show up in the wintertime to Brooks River once the bears have gone away?
I would say from my own experience that moose do tend to come down more often once the bears are diminishing, or at least in fall. A bit less competition for the resource, but moose do also just come down to rivers at that point in time, so it's what they naturally do for feeding. So it's once again probably a mix of several different factors of food resources now there, and perhaps less competition with bears moving on to different areas.
Less predation from, or fear of predation from.
Right. Well, every year is kind of a test for technology with the cams, so we're hoping that we can get the cams to run all winter, and maybe we'll all be able to see, if that's the case, if we see more different wildlife show up this winter. if I've got another question here, if multiple yearlings are emancipated at the same time from the same mother, will they roam their first season without mom together and maybe even hibernate together? So will siblings stick together their first year out of the nest?
Okay. It's certainly not uncommon for siblings to stay together for quite a bit of their first year. Whether or not they will den together, I don't know. I've not seen any reports on that, so I'm not sure. But yeah, it's certainly not uncommon for them to roam together. There may have been a case in Minnesota with black bears where siblings denned together after they were emancipated. But I'd need to look into that, and that's also black bears, not brown bears. So yeah, I'm not positive.
Populations can be different among brown bears, let alone other species.
Yeah.
When do the bears appear for hibernation? When can people start looking for them next year?
April is when I would expect them to start showing up, or when I would expect them to be coming out of hibernation would be probably around mid-April. Of course, it changes year to year. I know 2012 was an extremely cold winter and spring, heavy winter. So they probably came out later that year because everything was still frozen in May. Whereas the last couple years have been pretty warm, so it's very possible that they came out earlier the last couple years.
And it seemed like things got green really early this year.
Very much so.
So maybe they came out even earlier this year.
Yeah. This year was an extremely early leaf out.
Are there any plans to do any kind of collaring research or tagging bears at all along the Brooks River?
Not currently.
And so what are the benefits of not doing that, essentially?
Anytime you're talking about collaring bears or tagging bears, of course there's going to be a discussion about the impact to the animal. You can't collar a bear without having some impact to the animal. We do everything we can to minimize that impact, and any research that we're doing, we're trying to minimize our impact to the animal. But that would be one of the primary concerns, is trying to make sure that if we're doing this, we have a good enough reason for doing it, and we're not just doing it for the sake of it. Knowing where the bears go in August is probably not a good enough reason to collar a bear. There are things that I think would be interesting that would involve potentially tagging bears, but yeah.
So we've got to weigh the cost to the benefit.
And then, of course, there's also the issue of a lot of people don't want to see a collared bear or a tagged bear either on the webcams or in person. So that's something else that we'd have to consider.
Yeah. These bears that have been emancipated this year, new subadults, do they instinctively know to go dig a den? Do they learn that from their mother? They're probably not going to answer our questions, but do you have any idea?
Somebody's gotten used to my canned response.
I stole it from him before you used it.
Do they instinctively know, or do they learn it from their mother? So that is an answerable question based on whether or not... Once again, this is going back to black bear data. I know around the Tahoe region, black bears are very different, though. They don't really dig dens so often, as they just kind of use an available opening. I think that's an answerable question. I think I can find an answer to that. I'll have to look into it. I'm not sure. We could look at data from rehabbed cubs, though, that are released into the wild to see whether or not they see how they deal with that issue.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I'm starting to test it now on these.
Yeah. It's good.
Getting harder and harder. I thought we were going to stay easy this whole time. Do you ever collect fecal samples for the genetic study?
No, not for the genetic study. You can collect DNA from fecal samples. It's generally poorer quality DNA than you're going to get from hair samples, and certainly from tissue samples. The tissue samples and then the blood samples I'm getting from the coast, those are much higher quality DNA. The hair samples are not as high quality as that. Fecal samples tend to be worse. being in a wet environment tends to degrade DNA. UV and water are pretty much the two biggest things that will degrade DNA, and feces tends to be a fairly wet environment, so it's generally lower quality. You also end up with a lot of contamination from bacteria in the gut, or something else the bear ate, or something like that. Yeah, usually if you're getting DNA, my understanding of it, if you're getting DNA from feces, somebody's going to correct me on this. My understanding of it, though, is that you're generally getting it from they're swallowing their own hair, and you're getting skin cells from the intestinal tract and stuff like that. That's how you're ending up with their DNA in the feces. But
because that would certainly be easy to walk around Brooks Camp.
it would very much so.
There's no shortage.
However, at a certain time of year, it would be the feces would be very wet, and it would be a very challenging environment to get good DNA out of.
Okay, I'll move away from that subject.
But there was a question about it smelling bad in camp.
There was, yeah, and well, did it ever smell really bad in camp? I mean, I didn't smell it. I had no sense of smell though.
Yeah, there are times of the year you step off the plane and you can smell it.
I think I just got used to it.
So I always notice it when I leave Brooks Camp for a bit, and then you come back and you're like, oh yes.
But Brooks Camp, it is usually the feces that smell, whereas when we were at Moraine Funnel, it's the dead fish.
That's true.
I don't know if it's that the bears keep the dead fish cleaned up better at Brooks or what, but the dead fish doesn't get quite as bad there.
Very interesting. I've got a question here about females mating. Do you guys have any speculation as to who might show up with cubs next year? We had most of the females that we saw had cubs.
Right, yeah. It's almost like perhaps we're going to get limited next year with the number of females who could possibly show up with cubs.
Who's left?
Yeah, exactly. 410 is always...
always an option, I guess.
Unlikely.
Right.
Yeah.
435. Maybe she'll do a quick turnaround, but
how old is 435?
She's getting older, probably almost 20, around 20.
And that's the Yellowstone data showed that it was around 20 that you started getting reproductive senescence, and so it may not end up with cubs as a result.
261 though was another one. She gained a pretty good amount of weight, and don't know exactly if she's had a litter before. So this could be potentially her first one. She's younger. 289 seemed to almost possibly have had cubs earlier. It seemed like she had been lactating earlier in the season when we saw her. So perhaps there'll be another possibility for her showing up with cubs. Trying to think of any of the other sows.
I can't think of any that are left that don't already have cubs.
And there have been, there were some that didn't show up this year that may show up again next year.
Yeah, people have been asking about 813 who had yearlings last year. She wasn't seen this year. Maybe she just didn't show up. Maybe she'll show up with cubs next year. We'll see. It's always kind of the guessing game. Even if a sow doesn't show up this year, it doesn't mean she's written off. So that's kind of the fun part of 708 showing up this year. We hadn't seen her before, and then, or at least for a year, and now she shows up with yearlings. And you're like, that's your chick.
That's
cool.
where you've been.
Yeah.
Another bear that I think didn't show up last year was 469. Seems like some people have maybe been seeing that bear on cams. Did you see that bear at all in your monitoring sessions?
Right, yeah, unfortunately I didn't. I don't monitor at the falls for the fall monitoring, and since I've left, haven't been able to tune into the webcam. So it is possible, but I have unfortunately not seen that bear myself.
Yeah, and just for people that are watching, I was able to quickly download a couple videos that people posted, and to me it certainly looked like 469. Unfortunately, it didn't show up during your monitoring
I'm still
sessions.
Blind.
Another question here: do bears have to deal with ticks, fleas, mites, bugs, that kind of stuff?
Bugs, certainly. I mean, they have to deal with all of the biting insects that we have the privilege of dealing with here in Western Alaska. We don't have to deal with ticks out here. I don't remember if there are ticks anywhere in Alaska. I think there are, but I don't think we have them here. So we don't have to deal with ticks, and the bears don't have to deal with ticks here. Certainly other locations. I have worked, when I was working in Minnesota on black bears, I saw some very engorged ticks on a lot of those bears. But not so much here.
So mosquitoes, gnats, but not ticks. Cool.
Yeah.
A bear like 273 and her cub, is that kind of inquisitiveness that we see? Do you think that's a learned behavior, or do you think it's passed on through genetics? Again, that's not something that we probably know.
I'm not
maybe
sure.
We'll find out later.
What behavior are we talking about?
Just the, it seems like they're very curious bears. They seem to investigate things quite a bit. And by that I mean chew on the bridge.
And destroy half of camp.
Yes.
Yeah. Is that inquisitiveness? I'm going to go with the stock answer of they won't respond to my surveys. So I'm not sure. Yeah.
Maybe that's something that we can learn in future studies.
It's possible. The challenge with something like that is you have to be able to define inquisitiveness.
Right.
How do you define from observations what is inquisitive versus boredom versus natural desire for wanton destruction? Who knows? It could be anything, is what I'm saying. Like how do we define one behavior based off of behavioral observations is really tricky. If somebody has a great idea, I would love to hear it. Yeah, because we struggle with that even with say a behavior like a trait such as habituation. One of the things that I would love to study is the behavioral genetics of habituation. But how do you define a habituated bear?
Right.
That study has been discussed and even moderately attempted here at Brooks Camp before, and they did make a classification of what was habituated and what was not, and that was based on whether or not the bears would tolerate people consistently within 50 yards. However, I think there's also a very strong argument that every bear at Brooks Camp is strongly habituated.
Right.
So at some point you just have to define it, but how you define it is really tricky and has a lot of implications for the results of the study.
Well, we're coming up on an hour pretty soon here. I wanted to ask you guys one more question. What is the most difficult part of your jobs? You guys have extremely important jobs, and I'm sure at times very fun and rewarding jobs, but there's got to be some challenges as well.
Boy.
My laptop computer that's outdated is a challenge.
So technology out in Alaska can be difficult.
Well, and that kind of goes along with what I was going to talk about. The difficulties that I had with darting at the beginning of the season was challenging, and associated with that, logistics. I ordered a bunch of supplies early in the season and had. This is also one of those. This is the first year that I'm doing sampling, so hopefully it'll be different in the future. I ordered a bunch of supplies, checked the box for free overnight shipping, thinking it would not get here overnight, but maybe 3 or 4 days later it would get here. What I did not count on, because I was not aware of it, was because there were certain chemicals that I was ordering as well that have restrictions on how they can be transported. Every single one of those boxes was held in Anchorage for inspection. And then after inspection, there were only certain types of transport that it could take out to King Salmon. So what I thought was going to be 3 or 4 days turned into about a month before my supplies showed up. So that delayed the start of sampling. So that, I would say, is logistics in general is very challenging out here.
It's an incredibly remote place with really valuable resources. There's really no other place in the world than Alaska where you can come and see bears like this. So,
And logistical challenges or not, technology challenges or not, I don't think any of us would trade it for anything.
Sure.
This place is incredible.
Yeah.
We're very fortunate to get to work where we do and do what we do.
Yep. And the work you do is incredibly important.
Thank you.
Without people like you, this wouldn't be possible.
Before we sign off, actually, there was one other thing that I saw that came up earlier that I would like to talk about, which was the funding for my project. And I want to bring it up because webcam viewers are currently the primary source of my funding, and by that I mean I have other sources of funding, but you guys have been absolutely phenomenal. I've received, this project has received around $15,000 in donations, and so far that is what has paid for everything that I've done. And I just wanted to say thank you very much, and to everyone who's watching and to Explore for facilitating this. I feel incredibly lucky and grateful for that.
So without the work you do and without the support that you get, none of this would be possible. So whether it's donating to a study or being interested in bears and wanting to learn more about them and supporting us by being the viewership. If people didn't care about it, then we'd have no place to work. There'd be no reason for us to be here.
Absolutely.
So thank you everybody for joining us today and for supporting Katmai throughout the years. So.
Yeah.
We'll sign off for now, and we'll see y'all next time.